Well, hello everyone. Here we are talking about the Greeks. This is the part of your book that talks about the beginning of Greek culture, and we've already touched upon them in prior lectures, but we haven't really talked about them as a particular group. And so this is our chance to finally do that this week and also next week. So this week we're talking about basically classical Greece, what led up to classical Greece, and that'll lead to the stories, of course, of Athens and Sparta and their beginnings. And then next week, we'll get into how Athens and Sparta both become superpowers in their region and go into a giant Cold War, a 60-year-long war that almost destroys both of them. And that's just, I can't think of the time where that happened in history before. And I'm not saying it didn't when it comes down to especially Mesopotamia. It's just that the idea of there being a 60-year-long Cold War fought between two similar cultures that finally led to international involvement and an actual winner. Oh my gosh, man. Next week is going to be fun. I can't wait. Anyway, looking at this here, here's your timeline. And if you want to take a screenshot of this, you can. Your book has one that's similar. And it's not always a bad idea to just have these around. But you could see that there's some names that have been given to different aspects of Greek culture. I'm going to go through these real fast right here on the screen. So when we're looking at 3200 BC to 1100 BC or BCE, however you want to say it, we're looking at just the beginnings of people settling in this region we know as Mysia and Crete right here, and of course the Greek islands in general. Okay, right. So we're really looking here at just the very early settlements. You know, who kind of settles here and why? Who were the Minoans? Who were the Mysians? And what is the transition from archaic to classical? So let's move in. When we try to define what your book means or what any of us mean by Indo-European, there's these two main language groups, cultural language groups. We've got Indo-Europeans and we've got Semitic. Okay, a lot of times we think about Semitic as being Hebrew or Jewish in general, and in reality, Semitic means a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of current day cultures who come out of a Semitic cultural and language group. So we'll talk about that. That basically means coming from this kind of North Africa and Asia. Okay, whoops, sorry. And Asia location and creating a culture somewhere. So when we talk about people coming from more from the northeastern side of Europe, okay, or Asia, we're talking about Hebrew culture, Arabic culture, Aramaic culture, Phoenician culture, Akkadians, okay. So these are all people that are Semitic because they come from a sort of, if you look at all of Asia and Europe, you're looking more towards everything between modern day China and say Russia. Okay, and so you've got these nomadic groups that come out of that region, and hence Semitic, that's their region. Indo-European is if they developed around the Black Sea, so kind of northern Europe, central Europe, around the Black Sea, and also down into northern India, straight down and a little bit to the east. Okay, so if you came out of parts of northern India all the way to the Black Sea, you're Indo-European, and if you come out of Greater Asia or even parts of North Africa, you are some form of Semitic. Okay, that's just what that means. That's fairly simple, I think. And here's the language groups right here, if that helps any. Indo-European, okay, Celtic, Greek, Aryan, Old Slavic, all the way down to the Russians and our Armenians, okay? Right here, Indo-European groups that slowly expand into many other cultural groups as humans spread around the region, all the way down to Persian, right? And then as we look at these groups again, you've got Irish, Welsh, Germanic, okay, like the Frankish language, and of course the German language, the Swedish, Norse, Dutch, Germans, Old and Middle English. That's your Beowulf stuff, right? So this is all Indo-European. Then Semitic coming out of Asia and North Africa, and you've got this, right? Akkadians of Mesopotamia, Arabic language, the Arabic language which becomes adopted by what will one day become the Persian Empire and the people of Persia, right? So you've got Persians being out of Indo-European who adopt an Arabic language and cultural style. This is fun, right? Are you confused yet? Right? And of course, Hebrews are one of the biggest surviving groups that come out of the Semitic language groups of the past 10,000 years. And so when we say Semitic, we usually mean Hebrew, but we also mean a lot of different cultures that happen to be Arabic. And then there's this language group here from Mongolian and Korean mixing together ultimately to become Turkish. So this is, again, this is if you're getting into linguist stuff, this is what we're talking about. Greeks are coming from Indo-European cultures, somewhere between India and the Black Sea, and everybody else we've talked about are either a mixture of Indo-European a little bit. Mostly we've talked about people who are Semitic coming out of North Africa and somewhere in Asia. Okay, moving forward. As people from Indo-Europe, right, start to settle in the area we know as Greece today, what we're looking at then are a group of islands. There's some mainland, okay, and then there's about 2,000 islands which make up the Aegean and Ionian seas. Those 2,000 islands are where a lot of different peoples manage to get to, and they create their cities, their towns that turn into cities on these islands. And the people that settle on the mainland are generally separated by mountain ranges. And what that means is that people could create settlements and be somewhat isolated for a long time. So they may come out of the same language groups and maybe from the same original group of settlers, but these people develop into very separate cultures. So we've got the ocean, right, is a big part of the culture of Greece. So again, this is a group of people that are not evolving along a river like the Egyptians did, or the Mesopotamians in the Fertile Crescent, like the Phoenicians, the Greece, the people of ancient Greece are going to be developing despite the fact that they don't have a river just sort of dumping nutrients and fertilized soil and even natural grown crops, right? These guys have to actually really work hard to develop their society. So it takes them longer. They're not going to go as fast as the Egyptians do, and they're not going to go as fast as many of the Mesopotamians do, because they got to slowly learn how to survive in this kind of region and grow a society. So they do over a long period of time. So, you've got a maritime culture of fishermen and traders. You've got the need for colonies, because if you are growing a large population on an island, you're going to have to go settle another island eventually and make that part of a kingdom. Okay, so colonies are going to become necessary, and trade between each other and, say, folks like the Phoenicians and eventually the Egyptians is going to be absolutely necessary to your survival, because the area we know as Greece does not grow or have everything you need for a good, solid civilization. You got to trade for it, especially on the islands. If you're on the islands like Corfu, you're importing pretty much everything you need, okay? All right, so 3/4 of all the land in Greece is just mountain ranges. People living between and around those mountain ranges develops the culture of Greece, which means that you have these separate settlements. And when we look at archaic Greece coming all the way up into classical Greece, pretty nice temperature range, 48 to 80 degrees, not that different really from the West Coast here. Overall, a Mediterranean climate is what they had, and it's what we have. So it's very similar. Okay, 48 to 80 degrees was common, which means that there was a lot of open buildings, a lot of outdoor activities. Not the clothing was generally geared for warmer weather as opposed to colder weather. So you're not going to see the Greeks wearing lots of fancy clothes. You're going to see them wearing fairly simple clothes, because honestly, they don't need to develop really complex clothing styles. All right, so finally we get to the meat of the lecture. Who are all the different groups that develop finally? So here's all these words. So the Mycenaeans, coming out of Indo-Europe, right, somewhere between India and the Black Sea, who settle on the mainland around 2000 BCE. Their big city, that the ruins are still there. You can go and visit them, and archaeologists certainly have published plenty of books on it. The large city of Mycenae. So their city, the biggest city of the Mycenaeans is Mycenae, hence we call the people there the Mycenaeans, right? Warrior kings, of course, right, that dominate the region for quite a long time, about 500 years. Then we get here where we have the Minoans, and I was mentioning them on the map, but the Minoans are some kind of mixture between Mycenaeans and Phoenicians, we think. There's a link that happens. There's lots of myths that happen there. When we think about did the Trojan War really happen? We don't really know. We just know that out of all the cities that were built in the same exact spot where Troy was, that there is one layer in the archaeological layers there, the strata. There's one layer of 11 different Troys that existed over time that looks like it was completely burned to the ground. And that might be the Trojan War Troy, or maybe there wasn't even a Trojan War. It's just a story somebody made up. We don't really know. Okay, let's get to some maps. So right here, you've got the Mycenaeans, right? Mycenae, this is their region right here. And then you've got more Mycenaeans settling here. And eventually, because of the mountain ranges and the differences in settlements, you've got all these different groups coming out of it. So you've got the Pylos and the Melians. I'm not testing one of these names yet, right? Salamis, Athens, Thebes, okay? All these different groups that will develop into much larger, more powerful cultures. Okay, and then here's the Aegean Sea right to the east of where the Greeks are developing. All right, and so we'll get more to that in a bit. Here's the a artist rendition based on the archaeology of Mycenae, of what Mycenae probably looked like. So you've got, like everybody was building at the time, but by the time we get to 1100, everybody's building walls because there's constant attacks happening as different groups come to fight and take your stuff, right? So you've got walls, you've got guard houses, meaning you got some sort of military, right? You've got a graveyard. Okay, you've got residences, you've got a palace right in the center, and that palace, just like everybody else we've really talked about, is going to house your scribes, and it houses your tradesmen, it houses your priests, and it also houses, of course, whoever your king is, right? So in that sense, humans all throughout, that's probably a theme. You could probably say if there's a theme of history that you could look at, you could probably say that walls and building a palatial structure that houses all of your scribes, your learned people who could write things down and keep records, your priests, often they're the same people, and of course your rulers. That's something that seems to be common throughout all the ancient societies we've looked at so far, right? Just one palace that houses the whole complex, from the ziggurats of the Mesopotamians, all the way over to the palaces that the Egyptians built. All right, there's what's left. Is not much. This down here is what's left of the city of Mycenae, the great city, and even some of the artwork that remains that's still quite beautiful, right? These are found in a tomb here, so they did have tombs, and they bury people with their or items with their wealthier dead, which tells us that they had some thoughts on maybe an afterlife, which we know they did. You see this here. There's a mixture of both bronze in this. You can even see it because bronze is copper based. There's a mixture of bronze with this green, and there's a little bit of iron showing up later on. So we've got both a Bronze Age and an Iron Age developing culture when we get to the Mycenaeans. Interesting armor. This is bronze armor, which means it's pretty thin. It looks like it would be really heavy, and it probably is pretty heavy, but it's also very, very thin and wraps around a person. This is what you would see. You notice how high this goes here? This is what you would see on someone in a chariot. So essentially an armored tank is what this person is becoming as part of a chariot. Something like this, except that this actor's not wearing all that stuff, right? But there you go, right? This is the idea of a Mycenaean army. So if we talk about the Minoans, 3000 BCE to 1400 BCE, when we look at these guys, these are the ones that were forming on that island, which was, we think, a little bit Phoenician and a little bit Mycenaean. And they're on that island called Crete, just south of the Mycenaean Peninsula. And so we have a very interesting, distinct culture, and the artwork all looks Phoenician when we look at this stuff. And there's different skin tones on the people that are drawn in the artwork, and more lighter skin and darker skin. And there seems to be a general melding of people here coming from all parts of the Mediterranean. And this is somebody doing uh, we see this in cave paintings a lot. I do not know if anybody's tried to recreate this or not. It's always possible that someone has. But the Mycenaeans, excuse me, the Minoans, seem to have had a sport that involved jumping over bulls with the big horns on them, right? There seems to be some sort of athletic sport that they developed where they did this. And you see it on a lot of their wall drawings on their palaces and stuff. So it'd be interesting to see somebody try that. Extra credit, maybe? Just kidding. Do not do this. All right. So the two main cities of the Minoan culture, this very powerful trading island, trading empire on this island, is Knossos right here, and you've got Phaistos right here. Okay, so you got these two sides, and they're both powerful cities, and then there's less powerful cities, and then a bunch of towns. And these two powerful cities were powerful enough that they both had palaces in them. And because of the layout of this region and of this region, lower elevation, the palaces were built over hundreds of years. So they just kept adding rooms and putting art in them, and adding more rooms and putting art in them, which means that the palaces were very much like big giant mazes. So when we talk about the Mycenaeans coming up with stories about the labyrinths of Crete, that's really what they're talking about, we think, is these big labyrinth-like palaces that were just built over so much time, because they just kept on building these things. Again, this is kind of a mixture of Greek art and Phoenician art, which I think is just fascinating. These two cultures developed together over time. This is from one of their palaces, the ruins of one of their palaces. You see their artwork there and all the boats around them. And this here, what I find to be interesting, this is Egyptian. Over there in Crete, this is an Egyptian boat hanging out. This is a sign of trade, I would say, right? The Egyptians developing trade with the Minoans. Here's a reconstruction of one of the palaces right here, one of the ends of one of the palaces, just this beautiful artwork. There are frescoes and the dolphins, right? They're beautiful dolphins and fishes. I mean, don't these people seem interesting? I just wish we could go back in time and meet these folks. And here's that idea of the Minotaur. I forgot to mention that character in Greek myth. The Minotaur in the maze. Minotaur is this creature that is a mixture of different, that creates this horrible creature inside of the labyrinth. And that's something the Mycenaeans seem to have made up about the Minoans, which, we're pretty sure the Minoans did not actually have a Minotaur, but, stories are stories, and the Greeks were always good storytellers. So how about the Trojan War, 1180 BCE, if you look at your timeline? Troy, large Bronze Age city, there's this layer right there, layer 8. Ash and burned skeletons, only layer with evidence of violence. Probably the Trojan War period, if that is what it is. That's the only evidence of there being possibly a violent end to one of the layers. Again, there were many Troys that were built on top of each other over time. And there's just one layer, layer 8, that seems to have been violently ended, and maybe that's it, right? So Homer's historical tale about the Trojan Wars 400 years later, that's longer than our country has existed, and imagine how accurate that story might be, right? In fact, here's an image of the layers of Troy, original village all the way up, and then there's this one that's just destroyed right here. If you ever travel the ancient world, modern day Middle East, Syria and Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq and Iran and North Africa, you can find hills, and often those hills are just, the sandy covered ruins of many towns built on top of each other, right? It's really what they are. They call them tells, these mounds called tells, and they're like that. We now have you can follow her, Sarah Paycheck, on Twitter, And she is a satellite archaeologist. And her job, because it costs a ton of money to send an archaeologist to a hill in the middle of the desert to start digging and finding out if there was an ancient city there inside of that hill, right? And so she's able to use satellites with the permission of the US government to actually scan the inside of the hills to find out where ancient ruins are. A satellite archaeologist. Come on, how cool is that, right? Okay, so where was Troy? Right here, right over here. So if there was a war between the Mycenaeans and the Trojans, it would have been the Mycenaeans of here going over here. And all right, so what happened to the Minoans? Well, the deal is that there's this mountain not too far away from Crete, 1645, that explodes, right? It is a volcano. And it has so much ash coming out of it that it's worse than Pompeii, where Mount Vesuvius exploded and covered the entire city of Pompeii. We'll talk about that when we get to the Romans. Tidal waves, 200 miles up the Nile, right? Remember, the Nile of Egypt is about 1,000 miles long, so about 200 miles up the Nile. Huge devastation from the tidal waves in the Mediterranean Sea that really hurt Egypt, but it's also going to destroy the major cities of the Minoans. And huge waves. If you ever saw the horrible earthquake, underwater earthquake that resulted in the tidal waves going over the island of Japan and the Fukushima nuclear plant and the whole thing, we're talking about worse than that.
All across northern Japan, they felt it. A violent magnitude 9.0 earthquake on March 11, 2011. It was centered about 80 miles offshore, and tsunami warnings went up immediately. In coastal cities, people knew what to do next: run to higher ground. It's from these vantage points on hills and in tall buildings that incredible footage was captured. In Kesennuma, people retreated to a high-rise rooftop and could only watch in horror as tsunami waves inundated their city, knocking buildings into rubble and mixing into a kind of tsunami soup filled with vehicles, building parts, and contents. Seawater cascaded over sea walls and into cities. This video shows the water rushing over an 18-foot seawall into Kamaishi City. The seawall here was the world's deepest and largest, but not enough for the magnitude of the March 11 disaster. New technology left an enormous amount of visual evidence for study in years to come, and can perhaps help us better understand the power of earthquakes and tsunamis and prevent loss of life in the future.
The volcano actually causes a climate shift for a while in that one region because of all the ash in the area. So we've got two things going on. One, we've got a massive cataclysm that is ruining cities and destroying humans, right? And we've also got an inability to grow crops or some crops in parts of the Mediterranean because of how bad the ash fallout is from this volcano. So imagine the fires here in Southern California, times that by about 2,000 and add in a tidal wave, and you've got their really bad couple of years right there, right? So there's some islands and a major city near Mount Thera that have they just disappeared permanently under the water and also under mudslides and being covered by ash. And we have this other group of Indo-Europeans that come in and conquer the Mycenaeans not too long later. So the Mycenaeans collapse around 1200 BCE, not long after the fabled Trojan War, if it really happened. And these Dorians are a type of sea raider. Okay, these sea raiders, and they attack and they burn down the Mycenaean cities and they take over and build their own cities. So this is an era of time called the Dorian era. Possibly they're going to kind of breed in, if you will, merge in with the Mycenaeans that already exist, and ultimately the Dorians and the Mycenaeans will become the Greeks. put them all together and you've got the Greeks. The problem is that while the Dorians were in charge of things, it was kind of a dark age for that region, for the Greek region, because the Dorians didn't write anything down. They were not big on record keeping. So we know nothing about them at all, really, except for the architecture that they kind of brought with them when they built their buildings. We can say, well, that's a Dorian building versus a Mycenaean building versus a Minoan building. That's all we got. So these Dorians come in, and when we say Greek culture declines under the Dorians, that really means we don't have any records of whatever the heck happened during the entire time the Dorians were there, because the Dorians simply destroyed everything, took over, eventually just became Greek on their own by marrying in, by breeding in, and the next thing you know is you eventually have a kind of a new culture of Greeks coming out of this time. So that brings us to a more modern period. Rule and order in the Greek city-states, archaic Greece, 750 to 550 BCE. Note how late this is. When we start talking about Thebes and Athens and Sparta, right? When we start talking about the Greeks developing actual cultures inside of their city-states, these powerful cities that become their own little countries inside of their walls, that's the archaic period going into the classical period. So let's define what a city-state is, okay? 750 BCE, the Greeks developed city-states during that time. And we also call them polises, like the Acropolis or Theopolis, right? It just means city. Polis means city. And so we have these cities that are very powerful, and they are their own governments, their own cultures. Somewhere between 50 to 500 square miles, depending on the size of the city-state, is the territory that city-state will control, and somewhere around 10,000 people, although that will get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. There's this place called the Agora, which is the marketplace inside of your city, a very protected area, because that marketplace is your Wall Street, if you will, inside of a polis or a city-state. And then over time, this is going to be a fortified area on top of a hill, and we're going to start calling it an acropolis. So the hill within the city, all right, a fortified hilltop. So an acropolis, I'll show you pictures of Athens's Acropolis, which is still there and a major tourist attraction today. So here are all the different Greek territories. These guys here, Messina and Laconia, eventually this will be the region controlled by the Spartans. So these will all develop into very powerful city-states on all sides of the Aegean. There's an Acropolis right up here. You see right here are the outside walls of the original city, and inside of here you see this hill, and on top of the hill that's walled as well, and then up there is where your palaces are, your temples are, your marketplace is, everything that you need to protect. So if there are invaders, and if the invaders get past your outside walls, those invaders still have to get past your inside walls, the biggest walls of them all, right? Hard to beat Athens, so to speak, right? So there's a good idea of what Athens probably looked like when we get to somewhere between 700 BCE and, say, 500 BCE. You've got the city of Athens, and then you've got this Acropolis right here in the very top on a fortified hill protecting all the important stuff. Or it's possible that the Athenians, who traded a lot with the Phoenicians, could have gotten this idea from the Phoenicians, but they could have also developed this totally on their own. Who knows, right? Who knows? Anyway, building a democracy in Athens that's going to be borrowed by a lot of different groups in Western civilization over time, which is why we talk about it. Athens, in their city-state, by 621, has a type of democracy where the people are part of the ruling class. And that's sort of like when any of us go and vote, we are enfranchised to be part of the ruling class. We get to actually vote because we're citizens, and we have the right to say, or at least to put our 2 cents in, so to speak, to have an opinion that matters because we go and vote. Well, the deal is that this is citizens and I'll tell you which citizens in a second, are able in this system as it develops to participate directly in the political decision making. Do we go to war? Call in the citizens, have them vote. Do we raise taxes? Call in the citizens, have them vote. That sort of thing. Okay. So how do we get that? Because Athens used to be a monarchy. How did they develop themselves into a democracy? It's real simple. There's a series of events that happens wherein there were a lot of people, okay, a lot of people who were fighting, well, a lot of civil unrest between the common people and the ruling class of Athenian nobles. And the deal with that is that there was a point where it seems that the ruling class of Athenian nobles was about to get their butts killed by the common citizenry, not too unsimilar as, say, the French Revolution that happened so much later, right? Well, the deal is that this guy named Draco is going to become a king in Athens, and this nobleman king Draco is going to basically be the first to really side with the common people as opposed to his fellow nobles. And I think he has to do this because the nobles are either going to have to run and flee or they're all going to get massacred at some point. So you've got a situation where you have the first leader in Athenian history who develops a Hammurabic really style of legal code that is designed to basically regulate what the nobles can do and what the common people could do. It basically gave rights. This legal code gave rights to everybody and spelled out what those rights were. That's very important in any kind of modern society. You have to have, well, people just have to know what the rules are, right? Just like any student in a class needs to know how much their class is worth and how many points an assignment's worth and all these things, right? And what the rules are, what'll help me get a good grade and what won't. Well, somebody has to write all that down, and hence you've got a syllabus, right? The Athenians didn't seem to have anything like that yet. It was just nobles just kind of ran roughshod over everybody else. So finally, we've got a leader who is going to reform that, and that's Draco. Now, after Draco comes another ruler named Solon, and Solon is going to continue giving rights to the common people. One of those is he's going to abolish something called debt slavery. Debt slavery is something that's been around for a long time, and it's been in the modern era too in some Western countries. Debt slavery is when you owe people money, you're late on your debt, you're not paying it back, and so a court makes you a slave of whoever you owe money to, right? That's fun. That's a good time. So basically that was one way to handle people who were debtors, and of course that becomes a big form of labor. You take a citizen who owes money and charge them a huge interest rate, make sure that they can't quite pay back the money, and then you've got free labor because they're going to become your slave at some point, right? That's something that created a lot of tension between the common people and the nobility with this whole debt slavery thing. So Solon gets rid of debt slavery, and he's going to break the population up into 4 different groups. Your book will talk about that a bit, and all citizens, whoever that is, will define that, get to participate in something called an assembly. So what does Solon do? He basically creates, you guys, a type of democracy that's more like maybe a constitutional monarchy. Okay, there's rules, there's a parliament made up of citizens with some nobles and common people as well, and you've got, of course, a ruler, right? Cleisthenes will come later, and he's going to break up the power of the nobility even more, which is going to make him very popular with the common people, I would imagine, by having the citizens become the lawmakers. So whereas Solon basically creates a constitutional monarchy, Cleisthenes is going to create something that's a little bit closer to, say, an American system of a republic, where you actually have a democracy that also has a representatives in it, and it's got a leader, an elected leader too, not even a king anymore, an elected leader, and it's got this assembly that makes the laws. The leader doesn't make the laws; the assembly of citizens does. Okay, that's a little bit closer. It's not quite the same at all, okay, but it's a little bit closer to, say, an American style of democratic republic, which I think is interesting. These guys under Solon and Cleisthenes definitely took the idea of democracy in a city further than anything the Phoenicians ever did, as far as we know. So I want to say that if this idea came from the Phoenicians at all, this stuff is purely Greek. Okay. So who were the citizens? They had to be native born, so that they had to be born in Athens. They had to be property owners, much like the first American, or United States voters were. They had to be property owning. And we have to mention this: women, slaves, and foreigners did not have many rights, including that of being in the assembly or voting. Okay. How about education? Education was specifically for the sons of wealthy families. And women, of course, wealthy or not, were denied the right for an education because this is a patriarchal system of government. The Athenians were very pro male, having power, and basically hiding the women. Okay, that's going to be different from some of the other societies, but Athens seems like a very unique and forward-thinking society when it comes to democracy, for instance, and the right of the people. But it is very, if we were to be judgmental from a modern sense, which is really not the best way to do history, but it is very much not in favor of females having any rights within society at all. Okay, so keep that in mind. So there's Athens. All right. Sparta is going to be down here. And the Greeks, of course, the Athenians especially, were famous for their navy. The Athenians are going to develop a navy that's very much like the Phoenician style of military shipbuilding. Maybe they got that from them too, I don't know. And you've got the Athenians who are going to have a powerful navy that's different from, say, what the Spartans do, because the Spartans don't have a seaport. So the Spartans develop an army, whereas the Athenians develop a navy when it comes to their most powerful form of military. There's a modern, you can go do this if you wanted to after the COVID times. You can go and work on this galley and row it around the Aegean Sea like the ancient Athenians did. That sounds like fun. It's probably a good workout, right? If you're on the crew team, that's where you got to go for vacation. All right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Spartans. The Spartans are really famous from a lot of stories that have come out over time that really start with the Spartans themselves. They were masters of their own propaganda, and being able to tell the world that they were the very best soldiers and that they were impossible to defeat, and that they were, of course, a military type of culture that was suicide to fight against. That's a great type of story to put out there, and they were good at this kind of story because it keeps people from wanting to attack you, right? If they don't think that they can win. Well, the deal is that the Spartans are really famous for not actually, if we look at their actual history, they're not famous for being really successful as a military. In fact, the Spartan army, while good, was not all that much different than a lot of the successful Greek city-states. And in fact, some of these city-states will become far more interesting in the sense of what they could accomplish with their militaries, because Athens develops an army and a navy, which the Spartans don't even have a navy at all. And some of the other Greeks will develop cavalry, which can easily destroy infantry when used properly. And so the Spartans really didn't go around fighting anybody that much. And in fact, they were really good at politics more than they were at warfare. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But I just want to get to kind of who the Spartans were. Around 725 BCE, the Spartans are going to conquer that territory called Messina. That is this right here, Messina. And there were people that already lived in Messina. They were called the Messenians right here, right? And so when the Spartans get there and they decide to conquer it, let me get back to that slide, what they do is they basically subject the original inhabitants, the Messenians, to slavery. And so what Sparta develops is a slave-based culture. The Spartans themselves are the citizens. They are kind of like plantation owners of the American South before the Civil War. And they live a life of relative leisure, okay? Relative leisure. And that life of leisure and culture that they develop is based upon the labor and effort of the backs of the Helots, which are the conquered Messenians, who are the farmers and the heavy labor. So while other Greeks would have to sometimes, put their armor on and go serve in the military to defend their city-state, the Spartans would basically, they were able to have a standing army, which was kind of like a militia, really, because the Spartans didn't have to, like the other Greeks after the fighting, go back home to becoming farmers again, because the Spartans had slaves who were their farmers, and so when the Spartans came home from fighting, they went back to a life of relative leisure. Okay, so the deal is that the whole purpose of the Spartan military culture, of what it was really not to go fight others outside of Sparta and Messina proper. It was to basically keep the Helots in control, because every now and then the Messenian Helots would actually revolt and the Spartans would have to fight them. So the Spartans did not even have a standing army. They had people that were ready to serve and they trained, but they were like a militia again, as I mentioned before. They didn't just run out and, just this huge army comes out of the city of Sparta to fight to the death. That rarely ever happened. So what does that mean? All right, we've got the labor force being the slaves, and we've got a militarized culture of the Spartans that's not really a 24-hour 7-day-a-week kind of military. Who are these people, right? What is their story? So basically, they are like the other Greek city-states in that they have an assembly made of the citizens, and the citizens are basically the landowners. They are the Spartans. You have to be born Spartan, and then you are a landowner, and you get to be part of this assembly. Women were not part of the assembly specifically, but they did sometimes speak in the assembly, apparently. Women, unlike a lot of other Greeks in other city-states, women tended to be rather powerful in Spartan society in comparison to, say, even Athens. Athens has this rather modernized, in at least our sense, democracy, but it treats women like they're basically just jewelry. They're basically not to speak and they're not to be involved in politics. They're just to raise the kids at home. And the Spartans had women involved in all walks of life. They were involved in the assembly, even though they didn't speak much. Women were involved in raising the children for sure, but they were also involved in government, which is very different. What are the social classes? Oh, and women were trained to fight as well. Which you don't see in places like Athens. So citizens are your main Spartan landowner. Then you've got free non-citizens. These are basically your merchant class, all right, people that are visiting Sparta but are not slaves. And then you've got Helots, who are your Messenian slaves. Okay, this is your society. Why does Sparta have a very good organized military structure? Remember, the Spartans conquered Messina. They were a military then, and to keep the Helots down, the Spartans have to have, they have to always be ready to fight against a revolt. That's really it for them, okay? Now, every now and then we get to the big stories that we'll talk about later, like the Persian Wars or the Peloponnesian War, where the Spartan army did gather and fight and made a name for themselves. But the Spartans were much more likely to politically handle their problems than they were to actually go and fight somebody. Okay, so Sparta, right there in the very middle, not near a ocean harbor. Okay, so these are people who do have contact with other city-states, of course, because they are part of the political structure of Greece, but these Spartans don't really like to be bothered by other people, and they like to kind of be on their own, and they're certainly not developing a large, complex, artistic culture because they stay away from all that. They don't communicate with people from the outside nearly as much as, say, the Athenians did. There's an idea of the topography. It's a artist's rendition of the region of Sparta from a couple thousand years ago. Kind of cool. And then a little bit about daily light. What is the slave state of Sparta based on? How does it work? Well, the Spartan values we think are true. This is something that they wrote about, duty and strength. But, duty and strength and all that honor stuff,
there's some real background to this. They're not big into art, and the Athenians like to make fun of how the Spartans were kind of backwards when it came to art and culture. But the Spartans were involved in major political games throughout Greece, and they had a life of leisure. Okay, their males, the men of Spartan society were they were at 7 years old. They began training in these arts, and it wasn't just military training. In fact, that came much later. Unlike the movie The 300, if you happen to have ever seen it, likes to talk about, the Spartans didn't really train to fight until they were in their late 20s, and there's no evidence of them doing weapons training of any kind whatsoever when they were young. Just keep that in mind. But what they are learning, because again, these are all slave owners, so they all have power and they've got money and time. They are hunting, right? The manly arts of hunting and an athletic style of dancing and games. Right, this is the sort of thing these guys did. They were competing, and they developed their entire culture around these pursuits. And then when it was time to go fight, then they would go fight, and they did train to do that, but not until they were much older. So I just want to make this real clear. The idea, the cultish myth that of a harsh Spartan life of military service is something that the Spartans themselves begin to develop after the Persian Wars. And we'll talk about why when we get to the Persian Wars, which is in the next PowerPoint lecture. Okay, but it's something that the Spartans start to develop after that. And as other Greek city-states start to actually get more powerful than Sparta, Sparta starts to really move into this kind of myth that they're really this strong, powerful military state. Very much like, say, I would compare it to like the Soviet Union. Which actually was pretty weak in a lot of ways, but really, I mean, economically, but they really developed the idea of military supremacy, mostly to scare everybody else from messing with them. And that's something the Spartans really kind of developed, was this idea of military supremacy and a harsh militarized life. So males will move into a barracks for their manly training at age 7, not military stuff. This is all just, they're hunting and dancing and games and all that, right? They still have contact with their families. It's just that they're training to be men, these duty and strength and honor and all that stuff, right? At the age of 20, a Spartan male, it's not written here, but at the age of 20, a Spartan male basically tried to become adopted, almost like trying to get into a fraternity or something, tried to get adopted into a group of Spartans who had their own kind of household, a male household. And so by 30, most Spartans should be in one of these kind of military units. And this is the point of time between 30 and 60 where you were still doing all this stuff, okay? But you were training by 30 every month to be a military service person if you were called up to serve. And the Spartan military was really famous, not because, again, it fought all the time or was the most powerful military, but they were famous for their discipline and their drill quality, which means that when the Spartans did show up to be on parade with other armies, other Greek armies somewhere, or to actually fight, the ability of the Spartans to do kind of what like the U.S. Marines do, when they march in this way. I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you ever go to like West Point or something like that and just watch the U.S. Marines marching in parade like they're machines right at you, and then do a crisp turn to the side as they kind of march on their path, you actually think for a while that they're just going to walk right over you. They are terrifying. And the Spartans were really good at that. They were really good at both propaganda and putting on a show of how scary they were. And it really kept both the Helots down, and it kept people from wanting to mess with Sparta. So that worked, right? I wanted to mention that girls do receive some military training as well, but mostly for defense, for when the men had to go fight elsewhere. So it wasn't so that the women could serve in the army. Specifically, it was so that they could defend the city. And I just want to mention women had quite a bit of freedom compared to the rest of the Greek cities, and that's something that your book will talk a bit about. So, ladies and gentlemen, some images here of what is considered to be a Greek, not just Spartan, but Greek hoplite. a type of Greek soldier that is somebody with heavy armor, usually made out of layers of linen and wood, light laminated wood, a shield of several layers, very thick, heavy shield, right? A bronze helmet and leg protection. All right, and then a spear and a type of short sword. So we're going to move into the Persian Wars now because it's the first major event that pulls the Greeks together to fight against a common enemy. And the Persian Wars will develop two superpowers in Greece, the Spartans and the Athenians, both very different from each other. I'm looking forward to talking to you about both of those stories. See you soon.